Countries like Germany, Canada, in partnership with the European Union, can provide stability and prosperity for our citizens.
Canada and Germany say they're going to get serious about finding ways to export Canadian liquefied natural gas to German markets.
Canada can play a role in accelerating that diversification for Germany and for Europe.
Canada thought it had pulled off a masterstroke. An 8-year gas deal with Germany, wrapped in green rhetoric and sold as a bold step toward energy independence. Mark Carney stood at the podium, boasting that Canada was breaking free from America's shadow. The media cheered, Berlin applauded, and Ottawa congratulated itself. But within days, the cracks began to show. The so-called Independence Pipeline wasn't independent at all. It was tethered to U.S. infrastructure. Routed through Louisiana's ANR Southeast hub, suddenly, Canada's big victory looked like a house built on American sand. Washington saw it as freeloading. German officials began to whisper doubts. And Canadians realized Carney's gamble was less strategy, more stunt. This wasn't sovereignty, it was a trap, and what happened next would turn Carney's triumph into a credibility crisis. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and keep watching, because this story only gets darker. Carney's deal with Uniper was pitched as the cornerstone of Canada's energy future. On paper, it looked impressive. 80,000 BTU of gas shipped daily, adding up to more than 234 billion cubic feet over 8 years. Pegged to the Dutch TTF price index, the contract gave Ottawa bragging rights on the international stage. Germany, still haunted by its dependence on Russian pipelines, painted it as diversification. Canada framed it as proof it could compete with U.S. LNG giants. It was, Carney insisted, a strategic breakthrough, but here's the catch. Not a single molecule of that Canadian gas could move without passing through American veins. The deal wasn't routed through Canadian ports, nor through some shiny new infrastructure built for independence. Instead, it snaked straight into the United States, relying on the ANR Southeast hub in Louisiana. That hub, owned and operated under U.S. jurisdiction, became the choke point. If Washington wanted to close the tap tomorrow, the entire deal would collapse overnight. Think about that for a moment. Canada promised Berlin a lifeline, but handed Washington the scissors to cut it at any time. For a leader branding himself as a careful technocrat, Carney's oversight was glaring. He sold energy independence while tethering it to America's grid. It wasn't sovereignty. It was dependency dressed in Canadian maple leaves, and it didn't take long for Washington to notice. U.S. energy lobbyists were furious. They called it freeloading, Canada siphoning off U.S. terminals, U.S. storage, and U.S. ports without paying into the billions America had poured into its Gulf Coast LNG industry. Lawmakers joined the chorus, warning that Canada was undermining U.S. energy investments. After all, while American companies were building ships, terminals, and pipelines, Canada was trying to piggyback off their work to score political points in Europe. This backlash wasn't just noise in Congress, it carried real risks. Proposals surfaced on Capitol Hill to restrict cross-border pipeline access unless Canada agreed to cover part of the infrastructure costs. Some voices even suggested using tariffs, yes, the same Trump-era blunt weapon, to punish Ottawa's freeloading. Trump himself wasted no time mocking Carney's plan on Truth Social, calling it another Canadian scam. Meanwhile, Germany began to second-guess its new partner. Uniper executives raised questions about long-term reliability. If this so-called Canadian gas was just being funneled through U.S. choke points, what happened if American politics turned hostile? They remembered well how U.S. LNG contracts were weaponized during Trump's trade fights. Berlin needed certainty, not another geopolitical gamble, and that's when the narrative at home began to unravel. Opposition leaders in Canada smelled blood. Conservatives attacked Carney for risking the single most important trade relationship Canada has, the United States. They argued that instead of building pipelines to Canada's own coasts, he tied the country's future even tighter to American goodwill. The NDP took another angle, warning that Carney was overpromising to Germany on a deal that could collapse the moment Washington decided to flex. The image of Carney as the steady hand of Canadian politics, the international banker turned prime minister, began to crack. What was supposed to be his big geopolitical win looked more like a rookie mistake. Commentators branded him careless, accusing him of chasing headlines instead of protecting Canadian leverage. The Ottawa press corps, once dazzled by his polished delivery, started asking blunt questions. Why sell independence when you don't control the pipelines? Why bet Canada's credibility on infrastructure you don't own? The backlash was snowballing. And Carney, who had stood tall in the glow of signing ceremonies, now found himself dodging questions, facing criticism from all directions: Washington, Berlin, and Ottawa. But this was just the beginning, because what came next wasn't just angry words. It was a full-blown credibility crisis that would put Carney's political career under the harshest spotlight yet. By the summer of 2025, Carney's gas deal had morphed from a polished press conference into a diplomatic migraine. What began as a neatly packaged promise of independence was now an open wound on Canada's credibility. And the hits kept coming. The U.S. backlash hardened. Energy lobbyists poured money into campaigns painting Canada as a parasite. Think tanks published scathing reports warning that Ottawa was undermining America's billion-dollar LNG boom. Senators from Texas and Louisiana, states that had invested heavily in Gulf Coast terminals, accused Canada of sabotaging their workers by using without paying. In Washington's political language, that wasn't just rhetoric, it was a prelude to policy. Draft bills began circulating that would make it harder for Canada to access U.S. hubs without new cost-sharing agreements. For Trump, this was a golden opportunity. He thundered at rallies that Canada was cheating America again, stoking his base with visions of foreign leaders exploiting U.S. infrastructure. With an election cycle heating up, Trump's team framed Carney's move as proof that America's neighbors couldn't be trusted. And in the MAGA playbook, punishment was the only answer: tariffs, restrictions, and maybe even tearing up agreements if Canada didn't play fair. While Washington's fire grew hotter, Germany's doubts grew deeper. Uniper, under pressure from regulators and investors, pressed Ottawa for reassurances. Could Canada guarantee delivery if U.S. politics turned ugly? What if a Trump White House decided to shut off the valves? Berlin remembered Nord Stream too well. They had gambled once on Russia and lost. Betting again on a partner who didn't control the infrastructure looked reckless. German officials began back-channeling with U.S. companies, hedging their bets in case Canada's promises collapsed. At home, Carney's headaches multiplied. Parliament became a battlefield. Conservatives hammered him for jeopardizing Canada's most vital relationship. Why pick a fight with the United States while pretending to free yourself from them? One opposition leader barked during question period. Meanwhile, the NDP accused him of misleading Canadians with grand announcements that were built on fragile foundations. Their warning was blunt: you can't sell sovereignty when you don't own the pipelines. The media, once dazzled by Carney's global polish, turned. Editorial boards described the deal as a faceplant. Commentators questioned whether Carney was more concerned with headlines in Berlin than hard realities in Ottawa. The once steady technocrat now looked like a politician chasing glory at the expense of pragmatism. And then came the investors. Analysts began flagging the deal as a geopolitical risk. Credit agencies whispered about uncertainty in Canadian energy contracts. Markets hate instability, and this deal was dripping with it. If Washington could pull the plug with a single regulation, what was the real value of Carney's grand announcement? Traders saw fragility where Carney had promised strength. Desperate to regain control, Carney launched a damage control blitz. He called Washington, assuring lawmakers that Canada respected U.S. investments. He phoned Berlin, insisting that Canadian supply was reliable. He stood at podiums in Ottawa, declaring that the deal was misunderstood. But the optics told a different story. A leader scrambling to patch holes in a ship he claimed was unsinkable. Every reassurance only highlighted the fragility. Worse still, Trump smelled blood. His campaign doubled down, casting Carney as weak and naive. Conservative media amplified the narrative. Canada wasn't leading, it was begging. And when Trump compared Carney's miscalculation to his own proven strategy of using tariffs to bring industries back home, the contrast stung. Carney looked like the rookie, Trump the veteran brawler. By fall, the deal symbolized something larger: Canada's vulnerability. A country that talked about independence but still couldn't move energy without American permission. A leader who promised stability but delivered uncertainty. And a government that underestimated how quickly allies and adversaries could turn when the foundation of your strategy rested on someone else's pipelines. But here's the brutal truth. This wasn't just a gas contract gone sideways. It was a credibility crisis, one that shook Carney's image and exposed the fragility of Canada's geopolitical posture. And the fallout wasn't stopping anytime soon, because what came next was the question every Canadian was now asking: if Carney couldn't control the pipelines, could he really control Canada's future? So here we are. What was sold as a triumph of Canadian independence has been exposed as a dangerous illusion. Carney promised strength but delivered weakness. He pledged sovereignty, yet tethered Canada's future to the very U.S. pipelines he claimed to escape. Washington is furious, Berlin is nervous, and Ottawa is divided. And Carney? He's left scrambling, his polished image shattered by the cold reality of geopolitical leverage. This isn't just about gas. It's about credibility. If Canada can't control its own energy exports without American permission, what else is out of its hands? That's the uncomfortable question Carney can't answer. And as Trump seizes the moment, Canadians are left wondering whether their leader just made the biggest strategic blunder in decades. What do you think? Was this incompetence or betrayal? Drop your thoughts below, hit like and subscribe, because this story is only getting started.